All right, so we're diving into Zydus Life Sciences today. You're thinking long-term investment, right?
Gotta go beyond the headlines with this one. See if this company actually has what it takes
Yeah.
to really thrive over the long haul. So we'll be looking at their financials, obviously, their R&D pipeline, the competitive landscape is super important, even the management team. Gotta look at who's running the show. Ready to get our hands a little dirty?
I am.
All right, good. And just a little fun fact to start us off. Did you know that Zydus has a whole manufacturing plant in Myanmar?
Yeah, that's fascinating.
I know, right? Or how about this? They're developing a treatment for this rare inflammatory disease. I can't even pronounce the name of it, but I'm sure you can.
Maybe. We'll see.
All right, so let's start with the foundation, get into those financials. How healthy is Zydus really? Give me the rundown.
Okay, so, well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. On the one hand, their U.S. market share is huge, like 40%. That's a seriously strong foothold.
Right, but then their overall revenue growth has been pretty flat recently, especially compared to some of their rivals, some of the more agile companies out there.
Okay. So not exactly setting the world on fire.
Yeah.
But not a complete disaster either. What's the story behind that flat revenue?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Their profit margins are actually pretty healthy, hovering around like 20%, which, tells me they're managing costs well, they're squeezing those profits out of their existing sales.
Makes sense.
And then their debt levels, also pretty reasonable, which is great because it gives them that flexibility to maneuver, maybe make some acquisitions, invest more in R&D.
Yeah, you want a company with some breathing room, not drowning in debt, but able to make those bold moves.
Exactly.
For a pharma company, though.
Yeah.
I've always thought long-term success really hinges on innovation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
What's in the pipeline, what's coming down the road.
Yeah.
That's where the real potential lies.
For sure.
So let's talk about that pipeline. They've got this drug desidustat for anemia, which I know is a super crowded market.
It is.
And then there's seraglitazar, targeting NAFLD and PBC. No idea what those are.
Yeah.
But they sound pretty serious.
Yeah, they are. So NAFLD, that's non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It's becoming more and more common, unfortunately.
I've heard that.
And PBC is primary biliary cholangitis. It's a rare autoimmune disease that affects the liver. Both of them. Significant unmet medical needs. So big market potential there.
Okay, so big market, big need. But is Zydus just doing more of the same here? Or are they actually innovating?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Seraglitazar is particularly interesting, I think. It's received orphan drug designation and fast-track designation from the FDA.
Wow.
Which tells you that, they see it as a potentially game-changing treatment.
Fast-track designation. That's got to be a good sign. Doesn't that mean the approval process goes faster?
Yeah, it does. It really highlights the potential impact. And also, I think, speaks to the unmet need.
Yeah.
These designations are meant to incentivize companies to develop treatments for serious conditions where there aren't effective options.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's definitely a win for Zydus.
Okay.
But it also just reflects the urgency of the medical need.
Got it. So one potential blockbuster there. Anything else in the pipeline that jumps out at you?
There's ZYIL1, which targets something called the NLRP3 inflammasome. Don't worry if you've never heard of it. It's pretty complex stuff.
Yeah, that one went right over my head.
Basically, this inflammasome, it's a key part of your body's immune response. And Zydus is hoping that by targeting it with ZYIL1, it could be a game changer for treating a whole range of inflammatory diseases.
Like what kinds of diseases?
I think arthritis, Crohn's disease, even Alzheimer's.
Wow.
That's a huge potential market.
That's what I call thinking big. But,
Sure.
as an investor, I'd also be thinking about patent protection.
Yeah, for sure.
How strong is Zydus's patent portfolio?
That's a crucial point. And this is where things get a bit tricky. They do have a number of patents, but some key ones are expiring in the next few years, particularly in their generics business.
Ah, the dreaded patent cliff. That's when generic competition floods in and eats into those profits, right?
It's eggs.
So we really need to understand how Zydus plans to navigate this.
Right. Are they just replacing those expiring patents with new ones? Or are they strategically shifting their focus to products with longer patent life?
That's where their push into complex generics comes in, right? I remember reading about that. They're targeting like a multi-billion-dollar market?
Yeah, that's right. It's estimated to be worth over $20 billion.
Wow.
And because these drugs are harder to develop and manufacture, they face less competition.
Which means
higher profit margins. For companies like Zydus.
Potentially higher profits.
Yeah.
But also higher risks, right? I imagine getting these complex generics approved, it's no walk in the park.
You're absolutely right. The regulatory hurdles are significant. And there's always that possibility of delays or even rejections.
Yeah, it's a high-stakes game for sure. Okay, so we've got innovation, patents, regulatory hurdles, all part of the pharma landscape. But let's not forget about the competition.
Absolutely not.
Zydus isn't operating in a vacuum.
Nope. The global pharmaceutical market. It's fiercely competitive.
It is.
And, while Zydus has a good foothold in the US and India, they're up against some major players, both the big established giants and these really agile generic drug manufacturers.
So how do they stack up? Are they a leader, a follower, somewhere in between? Really curious to hear your take on their competitive positioning.
It's an interesting position, I think. Not quite a giant, but definitely not a small player either. They've got a good mix of those traditional generics, which provide a nice, steady revenue stream.
Yeah.
And they're making a real effort to move into those higher value complex generics and specialty products.
Right. And that push into specialty products, that's where their R&D muscle really comes into play. They're not just churning out generic copies anymore. They're developing innovative treatments of their own.
Yeah, which makes them a really interesting case study, kind of straddling that line between a traditional generics player and a company with these aspirations to be a true innovator.
Trying to have the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
But is that even possible? I mean, in such a competitive landscape.
That's the million-dollar question. And I think to really answer that, we need to dig a bit deeper, look closer at their financials, analyze that R&D spending, assess the management team's track record, all those crucial factors. That will determine their long-term success.
Sounds like we've got a lot more ground to cover. But before we do, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. With more on Zydus Life Sciences.
So those financials, we talked about their revenue growth being kind of flat, but their latest quarterly report showed only like a 2% increase year over year.
Oof. Not exactly inspiring, is it? I mean, for a company that's trying to, make waves in that specialty drug market. It seems kind of anemic, no pun intended.
Well, you have to consider the context, though. Zydus is already a big player, especially in generics.
Right.
So achieving those massive growth rates gets harder when you're already starting with such a large revenue base.
Yeah, if they're trying to move a giant ship, right?
Yeah.
Small adjustments take time to really make an impact. Yeah.
Exactly. But even with that modest growth, their operating profit margin has been consistently strong, around that 20% mark, which tells us they're running a tight ship, managing costs well.
Okay.
And remember, those healthy profit margins, they're crucial for funding future growth. Especially that R&D.
Right, of course. So they're profitable, even with the slow growth. What about their debt situation? We talked about reasonable debt levels earlier, but what does that actually look like in the numbers?
So their debt-to-equity ratio, it's currently around 0.8, which is considered pretty moderate.
Okay.
It means they're using some debt to finance their operations, but not excessively.
So not over-leveraged, which gives them that financial flexibility. But, high debt can sometimes be a sign of trouble.
Sure.
Are there any red flags we should be aware of?
I mean, we always want to keep an eye on debt levels, but in Zydus's case, I'm not overly concerned. They've got a history of responsible financial management, and their current debt load seems manageable, given their profitability.
Okay, that's reassuring. Now, remember that looming patent cliff we talked about? How serious of a threat is that, really? And what are they doing to kind of mitigate that risk?
It's definitely something to watch. They do have a number of key patents expiring in the next few years, mainly in their generics business.
Right.
But they're not just sitting idly by. They're actively diversifying their product portfolio, pushing into those complex generics and specialty products like we discussed earlier.
Right, trying to get those higher margin products.
Yeah.
Hopefully with that longer patent protection.
Yeah.
But, developing those takes time and money. What's their track record like when it comes to actually bringing new drugs to market?
They've actually been quite successful in that area. They've got a decent track record of navigating the regulatory landscape, securing approvals both in India and the US. Of course, there's always that risk of delays or setbacks, especially with those more complex products.
Right.
But their past performance, it gives me some confidence in their ability to execute.
So they're not just hoping for the best. They're actively trying to stay ahead of the curve.
Okay, let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the people running the show. Management quality, can make or break a company. And Zydus has that family-run business dynamic, which always adds another layer of complexity.
Absolutely. And in their case, they've gone through a fairly recent leadership transition. The founder, Pankaj Patel, stepped down as managing director. and his son, Sharvil Patel, has taken over. These transitions can be tricky, so it's crucial to assess how smoothly that handover has been.
Yeah, the classic passing of the torch to the next generation. So how's the new leadership team shaping up? Any signs of trouble?
From what I've seen, the transition has been fairly smooth. Sharvil Patel has been with the company for a long time, has a solid track record of success. He's well respected in the industry, seen as a capable leader.
Okay, no red flags there. What about executive compensation? Are they lining their own pockets at the expense of the shareholders? That's always a valid concern. But in their case, their executive compensation packages seem to be in line with industry norms. They're tied to performance metrics, so there's an incentive for them to deliver results for shareholders.
Good to hear. You want management to be rewarded for success, but you also want to make sure their interests are aligned with yours.
As an investor.
Speaking of shareholder interests, what about their dividend history? Have they been sharing the profits?
They do have a decent track record of dividend payments, and they've actually been steadily increasing their dividend payout over the past few years. Currently, their dividend yield is around 2%, which is respectable, though not exceptionally high compared to some other industries.
Right, so it's not a huge income play, but it's a nice bonus on top of any potential stock price appreciation. Shows they're committed to rewarding shareholders.
Exactly. And it also indicates that they're generating enough cash flow to sustain those dividend payments, which is always a positive sign.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Financials, debt, patents, management, even dividends. What's your overall take on their financial health and stability?
I'd say they're in a reasonably good position, profitable, managing their debt well, and they've got a history of responsible corporate governance. Of course, there are challenges, like that patent cliff, but they're taking steps to mitigate those risks.
So a solid foundation, but not without its cracks. And I guess that's where their strategic decisions, particularly their push into complex generics and specialty drugs, will really determine their long-term success.
Absolutely. Those strategic moves are crucial. But they also come with their own set of risks and rewards. And to assess those, we need to dig into their R&D pipeline, their competitive positioning, and the broader market trends that are shaping the pharmaceutical landscape.
Let's do it. I'm ready to dive into those details and see what the future holds for Zydus Life Sciences. Okay, so let's talk more about this big bet on complex generics. We're talking about a $22 billion market, right?
Potentially.
Yeah. What's the strategy there, and what are some of the risks they're facing?
Well, it's a smart move, but not without its challenges. Complex generics aren't just your typical copycat drugs. We're talking sophisticated formulations, delivery systems, sometimes even biosimilars. Think injectables, long-acting implants, that sort of thing.
So not just a simple pill anymore.
Exactly. The manufacturing processes are much more intricate, require specialized equipment and expertise.
So that's where Zydus comes in.
Right. Creates a higher barrier to entry, meaning less competition, and potentially higher profit margins.
But didn't we say earlier that regulatory approvals for complex generics can be a real headache?
Oh, absolutely. The FDA and other regulatory bodies, they have much higher standards for complex generics compared to your standard small molecule generic.
I see.
So there's always a risk of delays, additional trials, even outright rejections.
Okay, so higher rewards but higher risks. It's a tightrope walk. What about litigation? We talked about patent cliffs. But are there other legal battles they're facing?
Litigation is just part of life in the pharma world. Zydus has a few ongoing cases, mostly patent infringement claims. Pretty typical for a company their size. They're both defending their own patents and challenging others. It's a constant back and forth.
So they're playing both offense and defense in the patent wars. But even if they win these cases, doesn't it still cost a lot of time and money?
Yeah, you're right. Litigation can be a major drain on resources, even if you come out on top. And it can distract management from focusing on that long-term growth.
For sure. So it's definitely a factor investors need to consider. Okay, so we've talked about those internal factors, the financials, the pipeline, the management. What about the external forces at play? What are some of the big market trends that could impact Zydus's future?
Well, there are a few key trends that are really reshaping the whole pharmaceutical landscape. First, you've got that rising demand for generics and biosimilars, especially in developed markets like the US and Europe.
Right. People want those more affordable options.
Exactly. And that's a tailwind for Zydus's generics business.
But I imagine that also brings in more competition.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The generics market is getting super crowded. New players popping up all the time, many from India and China. with lower manufacturing costs.
So the demand is there, but the competition is fierce.
Exactly.
It's not enough to just be a generics company anymore.
Nope.
You need to differentiate yourself.
For sure.
And it seems like Zydus is trying to do that with their move into complex generics and specialty products.
Right. And the other big trend is the growing focus on specialty drugs, particularly for those chronic conditions like diabetes, cancer, autoimmune diseases.
Right.
Those are high-priced, high-margin drugs, and they're driving a lot of the growth in the industry.
It's like the blockbuster drug model,
Yeah.
but for a more targeted patient population.
Exactly.
And Zydus is trying to get a foothold there with drugs like seraglitazar.
They are. But the specialty drug market is also super competitive. You've got those established players pouring billions into R&D.
Yep.
So Zydus will need to prove that they can compete on that level, develop truly innovative treatments.
Not just Me Too drugs.
Right.
And remember those fast-track and orphan drug designations?
Well,
That's a good sign.
definitely a validation of their R&D efforts. But, there's still a long way to go. From a promising early-stage drug to a blockbuster therapy, generating billions in revenue.
For sure. Okay, so demand for generics, rise of specialty drugs, two big trends shaping the market. Anything else we should be aware of?
One final trend, and it's one that could have a major impact on Zydus's profitability. The growing scrutiny on drug pricing.
Yeah, drug prices have been a hot-button issue for years.
They have.
A lot of pressure on these companies to lower their prices.
And that could really squeeze their margins, especially in the U.S.
It's a balancing act. They need to innovate, develop new treatments, but also be mindful of those pricing pressures. It's a tough environment out there,
It is?
especially for a company trying to break into the big leagues.
Exactly.
And that brings us back to our original question. Is Zydus Life Sciences a good long-term investment?
After all this analysis, what's your final verdict? It's tough to say for sure. I think they have a lot of potential, but also facing some significant challenges. They've got a solid track record in generics, a decent financial position, and they're making smart moves into those higher growth areas like we talked about, complex generics and specialty drugs.
But no guarantee of success.
Absolutely not. The pharma industry is notoriously risky. You know there's potential for regulatory setbacks, patent challenges, unexpected competition, and now this growing pressure on drug prices.
So not a slam dunk investment by any means.
No.
It's a company at a crossroads trying to transform itself while navigating a really rapidly changing market.
Exactly.
And for investors who are considering a long-term commitment, it really comes down to their own risk tolerance and their belief in Zydus's ability to execute their strategy.
I think well said.
I hope this deep dive has given our listeners all the information they need to make an informed decision. We've covered so much: the financials, the pipeline, the competitive landscape, the management team, even those broader market trends.
We left no stone unturned.
Now it's up to our listeners to decide if Zydus Life Sciences deserves a spot in their portfolio. Well, thanks for guiding us through all of this.
My pleasure.
It's been a real eye-opening journey.
Glad to hear it.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Zydus Life Sciences. We'll catch you next time.
For another deep dive into the world of investing.